Okay, cool. All right. Okay, cool. Okay, so if you can't see my screen or you have any like technical difficulties, again, just reach out, let me know. But yeah, so we're gonna go over useState and useEffect today in React. The first one that I want to go over is useState. useState is probably the most kind of important and the most fundamental hook that we use in React. And what useState does is it basically just holds information. And so if you think of it that way, it's very similar to a variable, because a variable also just holds information. The difference between them, though, is that with useState, React can do some additional things that it can't do with just a variable. So I want to kind of run through that using this example right here. So this is just built on top of that old Pokemon, like Pokédex app that we did, I think it was last week. But inside of here, I have just added some JSX with like a button, actually 2 buttons, and like this number, like 0 right here. And what I want to have happen is when I hit this plus sign, I want the number to go up. And when I hit the minus sign, I want the number to go down. And I want to see that like happen, like on my site, without having to like refresh the page or anything. I want to like hit plus and just that number, I want to see it automatically, increase or decrease. So what we're going to do is, before we do useState, let's maybe think about how we might tackle this using a variable. So let's just kind of go through what I have so far. So I have these buttons here, and both of those, so like the first button has this minus symbol inside of it. So that's being rendered right there. And then this button has a plus symbol right there. And then between those, I have a span with just the number 0 kind of hard coded in there. Then I just have some really light CSS here just to make them a little bit larger so it's easier for you guys to see. You don't need to worry about that CSS. On each button, I have an on-click event handler added. And so basically what this says is, okay, when you click this button, do whatever this on-click is equal to. So in this case, I have both of these equal to this handle click function that I defined right here. So I defined the function here, and then I'm calling it here, and it will run when I click on the button. And all this function does right now is it just logs out to the console the string clicked. So let's just like see that in action. Let me try my server running. So come over here. So I have my dev tools opened up. I have my JavaScript console open over here on the right. So this is where I'm going to be able to see anything that I do a console.log for. So when I click these buttons, I'm expecting to see this string clicked show up over here. So cool. All right, I click the plus sign, and there it is. Sweet. So let's try the minus sign. There we go. So we'd have the number 2 next to this. That means that I've clicked. It's run this function twice. So I can just keep clicking that, and that's just going to keep happening. So I know that like my functions and my buttons are set up correctly. So now what I want to do is I want to try to get this number to go up. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a variable, right? I'm just going to call it like let's call it num. Let num equal, and let's set it equal to 4, just for fun, just so we can see it. So we have this variable called num. It's equal to 4. And what I want to do is I want for that variable to show up right here, and then to change as I click these buttons. So right now in my JSX, that number 0 is right here, right? It's just hard coded in there. Like this can't change because it's not a variable. It's just the number 0. It's always going to be that. What I can do though is I can actually pass in that variable. So now in this span here, which is right here, that is now no longer a hard-coded number 0. It is now equal to whatever my num variable is. And I had to put curly braces there because every time you use JavaScript inside of JSX, which is what all this HTML stuff is, it has to be inside of curly braces. And this num is a JavaScript variable. So for me to use it here, I have to surround it with those curly braces. So now if I refresh this page, what I should see is the number 4, because that is what my variable num is currently equal to. So let's just do a refresh. Okay, cool, there we go. Okay, so now I have a variable here that is set to show up right here inside of this span, and there we go. So obviously in my handle click, it still just has that console.log. So, I click that, nothing happens because I'm not doing anything with this variable. That's just staying there. But now that this is a variable, I can kind of like do some stuff to it. So let's go over here, and instead we don't need to like see that I click it every time in my console because I know that that's hooked up and that that's working. So maybe what I want to do is say, okay, so const handle click. Let's maybe say every time I click a button and I'm going to run handle click, I want to make num go up 1. So this is kind of some shorthand for, so like this num plus equals 1. That's kind of like a shortcut, shorthand way to code out num equals num plus 1. So what that's saying is I want my num variable to equal whatever the num variable is plus 1. And that is what this is saying right here. Num plus equals 1 is the same as that right there. So in other words, every time I click this button, this handle click function is going to run, and I'm going to set my num variable to equal what it currently is plus 1. So in other words, it's always just going to keep increasing by 1 number. So what we would expect is that we refresh this and get our new code loaded up into here. What we would expect is that if we were to press this, remember the handle click will run, it's going to increase our num by 1 number. So our num will then equal 5. And because we have the num here, we would think that maybe this would not upload, but update and become the number 5. So let's try clicking it. Okay, so nothing happened. It looks like that at least. Like we click this and that number is not changing. However, what is happening is in reality, the number is changing. The thing is though, is that we don't see it reflected on our page here. So I can actually prove to you that number is changing. So what I'm going to do now is whenever we click our button, the number is going to increase by 1. And then I'm going to console.log that number, like our number variable, after it's been increased by 1. Let's come back over here. Let's refresh this. Oops, wrong button. Let's refresh that. And what we should see is when I click this, we should see the number 5 over here, right? Because it should console log out my new number plus 1. Okay, there we go. We got the number 5. But it's not showing up here. You can see that as I keep clicking that, the number is increasing by 1 every single time. And we're console.logging that in here. So this issue right here, where we have a variable that's changing. We can see it changing because it's every time we click it, we're console.logging the updated number here in our console. but it's not showing up. It's not updating on our actual web page. That's an issue, and that's a problem. And that problem right there is what useState is, that's what it was built to solve. So what we would like to have happen is when we click this, and this variable changes value, so it changes from 4 to 5, for example, we want our window here, we want our web page to react to that change. That's kind of where React gets its name, is that it's a framework that can react to various changes and remount, or kind of not refresh technically, but update our web pages automatically on the fly as changes take place inside of our application. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to, I'm just going to comment out this variable. We're going to replace our variable with state, and we're going to use the useState hook to do that. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us for our React app to react to that thing changing and automatically update. So let's go ahead. I'm just going to like comment all that out. And I'll click. I'm going to make this the new function. I'm going to call it increase num. Actually, sorry, that's the minus symbol. We'll do decrease num, and then we'll make this one increase num. So now they're each going to have their own function. That's because they're each going to do a different thing, right? We want this one to actually decrease the number, and we want this one to increase the number. Before, they were both hooked up to this. So if I had clicked either minus or plus, the number would have increased. But now we're just going to separate that up. Okay, so to use useState, and remember, like useState is kind of a weird name. It's like one word, like useState. And I don't really know why it's named that way, but you'll get very, very used to hearing that. So when we use useState, there's kind of a convention to set it up correctly. So we're going to call useState usually at the top of our React app, or our React component. So in this component here, we're going to create some state. So I'm going to type out useState. It's going to auto-populate right here. I can hit tab. Oops, wrong one. I want to do the one with like the cube, but I can hit tab now, and it's going to auto-import it for me. So I don't have to like manually type that out. Okay, so we have useState here, and useState is, it's technically really a function. And what we do when we use useState is we want to pass in these parentheses, what we want the initial value of our variable, of our state to be, the thing that we're trying to keep track of. So in this case, remember, before we had a variable called num. We had it by default, like when our page first loaded, it started out equal to 4, and then we wanted to increase and decrease it. Now we're going to use state instead of a variable. We're going to create like a number state as opposed to a number variable. And instead of, saying it equal to something, we just put a value inside of these parentheses. And that's kind of what that piece of state is going to start out as. So we can make it 4 like we did before. We can make it 0, which probably makes more sense. If you have like a counter app, you probably want them to start at 0, and then you can increase or decrease as you want. So I'm just going to make it 0. And then you're going to set basically an array equal to this useState. So we have useState, we have our initial value here. Now I'm going to type const and then an array. So const array equals useState. Inside of this array, and this is always the case, you're going to set 2 things. You're going to set, I'm just going to call it num. You're going to set the name of what you want your state to be called. So just like when we declared this variable, let num equal 4, we gave this variable the name num. For useState, we're going to name it right here. The first value in this array is going to be the name of that state. The next and last part of this array that's going to equal useState is going to be a function that we're going to be able to use to update this value. And it's actually not that value, it's our state value right here. And by convention, you always name it usually set, and then starting with a capital letter, whatever the name of your state is. And that's basically it. Like that is how you set up state initially. And so this right here is replacing this before, when we just use like a normal old like vanilla JavaScript variable, which worked, like it did update, but remember, React could not react to those changes. It couldn't react to that value changing. With state, it's able to do that. So we now have a piece of state called num. We have a function called setNum that's going to allow us to change that state. We'll get to how to use that in just a second. And then we set that equal to useState right here. Then in the parentheses, we set what we want num to start out as whenever our component or web page loads. So now what we're going to do is, so we need to kind of define these functions here. So we have decrease num and increase num. So I'm going to define increase num first. So I'm just going to make a function. So like I'm trying to call a function here, but I don't currently have increase num defined anywhere. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to create a function called increase num, and I'm just going to set this up. Okay, so we now have an arrow function here called increase num. And what we want to have happen is we want every time we click on the plus button here, so this guy, we want to run the increase num function, and we want this increase num function to increase by 1 whatever value num is. So to do that, remember, to change the value of our state, this is where we're going to use this function right here. We're going to say set num. Remember, it's a function, so we're going to give it parentheses, and then we can give it some arguments. Num plus equals 1, like that. So this is very, very similar to what that is. So in like in a normal vanilla JavaScript variable, you declare it, let num equal whatever we want it to equal. And then to change it, you basically just have to say, the variable equals, and then whatever you want it to be equal to at that point. In this case, we want it to be equal to num plus 1. Whatever the num is at the moment, add 1 to it, and then set num to be equal to that. So this is going to increase our num state by 1 number. So, and just like a variable, so remember we named this num state, just like a variable, we can now use that in our JSX. So just like before, when we had this variable called let num equal 4, whenever we used num down here, it came over here, that would equal 4 right here. But now we're not using this variable, we're using state. But in the same way, our state is called num right here. So we can just use it just like that, just like a vanilla variable. But this time it's going to be equal to initially whatever we set here. So now we've done this, it's saved, let's hit refresh, and this should now equal 0. Because that's what our num state is set to initially, and we're passing that in right here. Okay, so we got an error. Let's see what it says. Decrease. Oh, okay. So this is actually really good. We can do a little bit of debugging. So I got an error. Encountered error. Blah 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 blah. Reference error. Decrease num is not defined. So that's actually a really helpful error. So if we look over here, we can see that on line 29, for this button, I'm passing a function called decrease num to my onClick, but we don't have decrease num defined anywhere. We have increase num defined right there, but we don't have decrease num. So I'm just going to really quickly num equals I'm just going to define that really quick, and I'm just going to do a console log that just says decrease, just so that I have a function like defined there, so we don't throw that error. So okay, let's come back here, hit refresh. Let this do its thing. Remember, our number should be 0, perfect, because num is our state, which initially equals 0. Remember, so if we can change that 0 to say equal 35, hit save. That means that now our num state, the initial value that it's going to have whenever our page loads is going to be 35. So if we refresh this page now, this number should be 35. All right, cool, there we go. But we don't want it to be 35. We want it to start out at 0. So I'm just going to change that back to 0, hit refresh. And then now let's test out our plus button. Because remember, our decrease button just is doing this console log. It's not really like, it's not going to change this number at all. But let's check to see if this works. So we click this button, we're going to run increase num, like this function called increase num, and it's going to set our number equal to the num plus 1. So if we click this, okay, so we got an error here. Num is read only. Is it constant num? I think we set num to num plus 1. I think, let's see. Num. Yes. There we go. Okay. Let me try that really quick. One sec. I think that was the issue, and I'll explain what that was. Okay, there we go. Okay, so what we had before is I had num plus equals 1 inside of my set num function. And remember, num plus equals 1 is really equal to this. It's the same as this statement. Num equals num plus 1. But remember, in our set num function, we don't want to pass in an equals statement. We don't want to say num equals something. Whatever we pass into here is going to be what our num changes to. So we can just say num plus 1. We don't need to do num plus equals 1. So like we're going to set num to whatever num is plus 1. So save that, we'll come back here, refresh it. This will get set back to 0, because that's going to be our initial state. Let this load. Okay. But now you can see that when I click this, this number updates, because what's happening is React is saying, oh, okay, you're using useState. You're not using a variable called num. You're using a piece of state called num. And whenever num changes, React knows that, okay, I'm going to update my web page. I'm going to update this component on the web page and reflect the changes that took place here. So now we can actually increase and change this number, and it's going to, our app is going to react to that change. That only happens with useState. And that is like, that's the magic of useState. It's really, really cool. So yeah, that's essentially how that works. So we could do the same thing for our decrease, just really quick. So in our decrease num, we would set num. We would set num to equal num minus 1. Hit save, hit refresh. So now when we click the minus button, our number is going to decrease by 1. And every time we do that, our React app is going to react to that and then give us that change. It's going to show us that change. So yeah, so that is essentially state. And that's why we want to use state over variables inside of a React app to store information that could change and that we need to have show up on our web page. So really quickly, does anyone have any questions at this point about useState?
So with useState, it just looks like maybe it's like a more solid, simpler way to use variables to like define things. Is that what I'm getting at?
Yeah, so yeah, it's not this. I mean, variables are pretty simple. You just say let num equal 4, and then you can say now num equals 6. So we declare it here, it equals 4, then we can just say num equals 6. So that's pretty simple. useState is maybe slightly more complicated just because you have to use this syntax here to set up the state. And then you have to use this function here to kind of control the updating of that. Like with state, like we now have num that is now a name for a piece of state. We can't now say like num equals 8 or something. That's not going to work. The only way to change that value is to use our setNum function. So state is slightly more complicated maybe than using a function, but the benefit that it gives us is that our React application can react to changes in state. So we can see our state actually updating on our website, but with a variable, we can't see that. So that's kind of the main difference there. Any other questions about states? Cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's talk about useEffect. That's kind of that's probably the next most important React component. So let me decrease that. Okay. All right, so what useEffect is it is basically a way for us to tell React to do certain things whenever our component sort of like remounts or re-renders. So every time we change state, so which we're doing every time we click this button, remember we click either one of these buttons, the minus or the plus, and the plus one's setting num to this set num is changing our state. The minus one is setting num to be -1, so the set num is changing our state. Every time we change our state, what's happening is this component, and by this component, I really mean this component, the app.js component here, that is re-rendering. It's like remounting. It's kind of like refreshing, but it's not. It's kind of like a behind the scenes thing. But you can kind of just think of it as like it re-renders whatever is on here with the most up-to-date information, which is why our numbers can change here. With useEffect, what we can do is we can then tell React to do something every time a component re-renders. That's kind of like the magic and like the cool thing about useEffect. So let's set it up first, and then we'll kind of get into like the details. So just like how useState has a very specific way that you have to basically follow to set it up correctly, useEffect is the same way. You use it in a very kind of prescribed way, and you'll always set it up in sort of the same format. So what you'll do is, and I like to actually usually put my useEffects right after my state statements, and then I have all of my logic like functions and other stuff for my component below that. So I'm going to put that down there. I'm going to put my useEffect underneath my useState. So to use useEffect, you're going to type useEffect, and again, it should kind of bring up sort of like an autocomplete. You can hit tab, and it's going to auto import it for us. Remember, like useState and useEffect are built-in tools, built-in hooks inside of React for us to use, which is why we have to import it from React to use in our file. After you've imported it and you have useEffect there, what you're going to do is you're going to give it some parentheses, because the useEffect is like technically a function. And then in this function, you're going to pass it what's called an anonymous function, which is really just an empty JavaScript arrow function. And the way you do that is just an empty set of parentheses, an arrow, and curly braces. That's it. That is what is known as an anonymous function. It's basically just an empty JavaScript function. It doesn't have a name. It doesn't even have any arguments in there. It's just this kind of empty, like, I don't know, like skeleton of a function. I'm gonna hit enter just for formatting's sake. Inside of our useEffect here, so inside of these brackets, this is where we put the code that we want to have run whenever our component re-renders. So I'm just going to say console.log component re-render. And then the last thing we have to do is we need to do a comma here after the closing curly brace, but before the closing parentheses, so the last parentheses. And I'm going to throw in an empty array here. I don't want to talk too much about why we have to do that right now. Just know that for the moment, you have to add that empty array. That is going to tell React. That's kind of like finishes our setup. And what that empty array says is every time this component, our app.js component, re-renders, we want whatever is inside of here to happen. In this case, we want to log to the console this string, the component re-rendered. So let's come back over here and let's hit refresh. So remember, with useState basically causes our application to react to changes inside of that state and causes our component to re-render. So because if we hit this button, you know, our state will change, our num state will change, it'll increase by 1 or decrease by 1, depending on what button we press. Our component or our app is going to re-render. And now, because we have this useEffect, this will run every time our component re-renders. So let's do this. And okay, you can see already, I just did a brand new refresh, and we get right here, the component re-render. That's because our component, when you hit refresh, it renders for the first time. And so every time, remember, when our component renders, this is going to happen. That's going to include our re-render. So we can click that. And, oh, oops, okay, sorry. I made a mistake. So actually, okay. Let me do this real quick. 1 second. There we go. Okay. Okay, so without that last array. So remember how I said you had to put this array here? That's actually for a slightly different thing that we're going to talk about next. So when you have the useEffect here, and you have, you know, your code that you want to have happen whenever the component re-renders, we want to have, we don't want to have this array here. We just want that to look just like that. Okay, whenever it's set up this way, now this is where every time our state changes and our component re-renders, you can see that our state is changing and the component re-rendered text here is happening. Because our useEffect is making this text, this code run every time our app re-renders, which is happening because our state is changing. Those two things are very linked. Okay. The next thing that I want to talk about is what I did before, and I kind of jumped the gun a little bit, is when we set up our useEffect to have an empty array right here. Okay, so remember, without the empty array, every time our component re-renders, it's going to run whatever this code is. When we have the empty array here, the use effect is going to change slightly. What's going to happen is now, whenever our component renders for the very first time, this code is going to run, but it's not going to run again. So that is called like whenever our component is first loaded up for the first time or first renders for the first time, that is called a component being mounted. So our component mounts. And you'll often hear this in like the React JavaScript world, but you'll hear like when a component is on mount or on mount, I want X to happen. What that means is when our component is sort of loaded up for the first time. So you can see how, you know, I'm just going to change this. The component re-rendered hi there. So I'm just going to, I added that hi there, right? So now if I refresh, I should see that happen right here because our component is going to mount for the first time and boom, there we go. You see the hi there. But the cool thing is that now this is not going to run again. It's only going to happen on mount, which means whenever our component is kind of loaded up for the first time. So I can change our state. Remember, every time I change our state, our component is re-rendering, but it's not remounting. It's not getting like freshly reloaded. And those are two terms that are important to kind of at least be aware of, that like re-rendering and like remounting are two different things. Remounting is more like what happens when you like click like refresh. Again, components can mount without having to hit that refresh button, but it's kind of like a hard refresh. And we'll talk more about some of those like nuances later. But for now, just know that when you have the array, this empty array added here, this code is only going to run sort of when your component first does like a fresh mount. And it's not going to run after that. Even if our state changes, and even if when our state changes, our component is re-rendering, right? Because it's reacting to the state and it's showing us the updated state value every time it changes. So that is what that does. There's kind of one other important thing with useEffect. So remember, the first option is no array. That just means this code is going to run every single time our component re-renders at all. The other option is to have an empty array here, which means that this code is only going to run on first mount, like when our component is first loaded up, then this will run. The last main thing, the last main way that we'll use it is to actually pass in a value into this array. And typically what you're going to pass in there is a piece of state. So remember, we have a piece of state called num. And so we can pass that value into this array. What that is going to do is that's going to say, okay, every time that our state, this state changes that's inside of this array, we now want this code to run. So in other words, if we click this button, our num state is going to change because it's going to either decrease or increase. It's going to react to that change and run this code. So it's going to be very, very similar to when we didn't have that. The only difference is that we're now specifying that we will only want this code to run in reaction to num, our state num changing. So let's hit refresh and let's see if we can get this to run every single time our state changes. Okay, so we got that there. Cool. So now we see that our state is changing, and every time it changes, this happens. So what I could do too is I'm just going to create one more piece of state. I'm just going to call this like test state. And then I'm going to set my function to change that value. I'm going to change that to set test state. And I'm going to set this equal state. I'm going to set this equal to just a string called test state. So this is just like a random piece of state here that I'm calling test state. I have my function here that I set up so I can change that value if I want to. And then I just set the initial value of this test state to equal this string that just says test state. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in test state now. So I didn't pass in num, I'm going to pass in test state. So now what should happen is every time my test state changes or updates, this code should run. But this code should not run any other time. So let's come back over here. Let's hit refresh. And let's let this reload. Okay, we're back to 0. Now, if I hit this, my number should still change, but because my useEffect is now tied to test state instead of my num state, this should not happen because I'm not changing my test state. This isn't going to change when I hit the plus or minus button. Just the num state is going to change. So hit that, and there we go. We have our numbers changing, but we don't have that useEffect happening over here. So yeah, that's kind of like, that's useState and useEffect like in a nutshell. There are like a ton of like practical applications for this. Like this is sort of like a dumb example, just so I could explain kind of how they're working and what they do. Like what happens when you use useState and like why you should use it. What happens when you use useEffect. But you're going to use both of those hooks like all the time in most of your homework. And basically anytime if you ever create a React app, these are going to be really, really commonly used tools for you in your tool belt. So we have a couple of minutes left, about 15 minutes. What I was planning on doing is at this point, maybe talking about how this like useEffect and useState kind of connect to like when we make our Axios calls and like why, we'll put Axios calls inside of useEffect. Some of you probably can already kind of guess why, but I could explain that a little bit more in depth. Or if anyone has any other questions or something else they'd like me to go over, we can spend the last 15 minutes going over that. So what do you guys think? Do you have any like, I don't know, specific concepts or ideas that you'd like to cover?
I think what you were about to do with the Axios call sounds good to me. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, let's go over that really quick. So, all right. So we have this component here now. Has some state, it's got useEffect, it's got a counter on it that we added. Let's kind of try to apply useState and useEffect to a more sort of like a practical application. So let me see. I have, okay, so what I'm going to do is on this page, I'm going to try to get all of my trainers. So I have seeded my database with, I think it's like 10 trainers, and they all have like their own like Pokemon or whatever. We're going to use an Axios call to try to get those trainers. So what I'm going to do is actually just down here, I'm going to create a function called get trainers, because this is the function I want to run every time I want to get my trainers in my database. I'm going to say const get trainers equals, and just set up this function really quick. And there we go. Then what I want to do is for this is going to be an Axios call. And whenever you make an Axios call, it's almost always you're going to want to use async await. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about what those specifically do. That's kind of like a different topic. So for now, just know you have to call your async there. And then you can have inside of this function, you can have a try catch block. And so it's try catch is kind of like an if else statement. Like it's a little bit different, but it's kind of like that. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about what that is. But what we want to do is we want to do our Axios call inside of this try block right here. And so in there, I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it res, set it equal to Axios.get, and then in there, I'm going to put a URL. And before that Axios call, I need to call await. So again, don't worry too much about what those do. James, I'm sure, went over it. We can go over it at another time, but we just have to put those there. Okay, so this Axios.get, what this is going to do is this is going to ping, it's going to hit a URL that we send, that we pass into here. The URL that we want this to go to is going to be whatever URL hits our trainers controller and gets us all of our trainers. That's going to be our index method. That is almost always the case. Like in your controllers, your index method is going to be the method that grabs all of whatever model you're trying to get. In this case, I'm trying to get all the instances of my trainer model. So remember, like this method, I have a variable called trainers, saying equal to trainer.all. And then instead of rendering a component, which we kind of have done in the past, I am instead rendering some JSON. And JSON is really just kind of an array of hashes. That's kind of the easiest way to think about it, or an array of JavaScript objects, because JavaScript objects are basically the same as Ruby hashes. And JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So that's kind of how, was one way you can kind of remember it. So like, okay, it's object notation. It's going to be a way to write out objects. And JSON is basically the way that we get our information that we want. So I'm going to render out some JSON. Actually, to make that app trainers like that. And cool. So this, whenever we hit this method, we should get JSON data that is equal to all of our trainers. So now what we can do, we can go to our routes here and we can be like, okay, let's go look at our trainers routes. Remember, we want to hit the index because we want to get all of our trainers. So in this this column here, controller action, this is literally describing like what's going on with like how this is set up. So it's going to be the controller first, then a hashtag symbol, then the action that's going to take place. So we would go down here, we're like, okay, got our trainers controller here and the index method, which is exactly what we want. Cool. That is going to give us a URL right here. /trainers. So if we run a get, if we use this verb, this HTTP verb, get, on this URL, we should get the JSON that is coded out right here. So let's go back to here, and I'm going to put /trainers right there. Okay, so now we can run get trainers. And whenever we run this, we are going to set a variable called res, and we're going to set that equal to whatever information our Axios call gets from this URL, which hopefully is the JSON data of all of our trainers. So I am going to just test it. I'm going to make a console.log. I'm just going to console.log out res. So I'm going to get the data, set it to res, and then I want to like look at that res in my console. So over here, so that I can make sure that I'm getting that information. So what I'm going to do is, this is where our useEffect is going to come into play. So I'm just going to kind of clear this out. Okay, now we just have sort of this empty useEffect right here. And this useEffect, remember, with this, the empty array here, this is set up so that whenever our component sort of mounts for the first time, it's going to run whatever code is inside of here. I want this code to run. I want my get trainers function to run. So remember, the useEffect with the empty array, when this app.js component first loads, it's going to run get trainers. That's what I want to have happen. I want this page to load up, and I want it to automatically get all of my trainers and then log all those trainers to the console right here. So let's do that. Let's hit refresh and let's see if that works. I might run into an error. I might have like a syntax error somewhere, but we'll check. Okay. So we ran it, but I didn't see this console.log take place. So that makes me think that something broke on somewhere in my function. So I'm gonna fill out this catch portion here, and I'm gonna say console.log there, and I'm gonna refresh here, and let's see if we get an error over here. Oh, okay, perfect. Axios is not defined. Okay, so remember the try catch block is basically like it's going to try to do this. If it fails or it can't do that, then it's going to do whatever's in the catch block. So I console.logged out this error. This told me exactly what's wrong here. I forgot to import Axios. Like I said, it's not defined. So I'm just going to import this really quick. Let's see if it'll. Oh, you know what? I don't think I've added this even to this this project. So Axios is a library that you have to add. So I'm just going to do yarn add Axios really quick. Just new events. Oh, okay. We're in SSR. Hang on a sec. How do I add? I don't remember exactly.
I think you put yard instead of yarn. That's all.
Oh, I did. Okay. There we go. Okay. Cool. Sorry, I have a I have an extension that like auto corrects things for me. It's called the F word. I can show you guys it later. It's pretty helpful, but
That's awesome.
there we go. Okay, now we got it in. All right, sweet. So now we got here. Now we can go back over here. Now we can import that. Great. Okay, so now Axios is imported, and yeah, so it's added to our project, etc. So that's good. So now I'm just going to run my server again, like that. Let that kind of do its thing. Okay, refresh again. Now we should at least see something over here, either our console.log with our data in it that we want or an error. Okay, cool, here we go. So we got some data. It's an array with 10 things in it, which is exactly what I'm expecting because I generated in my seeds file 10 trainers. So we can go into here, and here are the trainers. Perfect, okay. So we now know that res is equal to the data that I want. So this is where state is going to come into play. I'm going to create some state called trainers. And then I'm going to create my method to update that state. And I'm going to give this a default value of an empty array. So I just want trainers to just at the outset equal an empty array. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to set trainers here inside of this function wherever I get my trainers. I'm going to update the value of trainers, which right now is just an empty array. That's just kind of a convention. But I want to update that to equal this. I want my trainers state here to equal my array of hashes, my array of all of my my trainers. So you can see that like this res here is actually kind of some nested stuff. It's like this hash here with like this key of data. That key of data is equal to my array of all my stuff. So what I actually want to do is I don't want to just use res. I want to use res.data like that. So trainers will get set to equal this data over here. Okay, cool. Let's just save that and let's just refresh, make sure I didn't like break anything. Okay, cool, sweet. So we're good to go now. So now trainers, we have a piece of state called trainers that is equal to all of my trainers right in here. So at this point, remember we've used useEffect to run, like it's going to automatically run our getTrainers function whenever this component mounts or loads up for kind of the first time. That is going to do an Axios call against the URL that I have here, which again is pointing to my trainers controller and then the index method there. So trainers controller, index method. This is rendering out some JSON of all my trainers. So it's going to grab that JSON. And then I'm setting that to some state that I'm calling trainers. So at this point, what I could do is I could pass in trainers in here. And I want to see if anyone remembers what happens, like what happens to useEffect whenever we pass in a piece of state inside of this array. Does anyone remember?
It re-renders, right?
It re-renders when?
Or like every time that changes,
Exactly.
trainers changes.
Yes, that's
Okay.
exactly right. So what we're saying is we pass in trainers here. Now we're saying, okay, every time trainers changes, now we want to run this stuff. So we're not going to get into this now, but this is crucial because this now connects to our future CRUD actions. For example, let's say, we did our read. So we now, we have our trainers here. We could now kind of maybe create a function called render trainers. And we could map over our trainers and return some JSX for each trainer, which would basically, list them all out here. That's cool. Let's say then we wanted to create a trainer. We wanted to do the create part of CRUD. We could add a form that lets us fill out all of the pertinent data for that trainer. We could hit submit. That submit button is going to not only do an Axios post, so it's going to send the data to the database, but we're also going to update our trainers to include that new information. That is going to cause because the trainers is going to update, that's going to cause the getTrainers function to run again. It's going to re-grab all of our trainers from the database, set our trainers to that data, but this time, our data is going to include that new person that we just added. Same with delete. What we can do is we can delete a certain trainer if we have like a button or whatever. And in that delete method, not only do we actually do an Axios call to delete that record from our database, but we also set trainers to filter out whatever trainer we just removed. That's going to cause a change to our state, which is going to cause our useEffect to run getTrainers again. And then our list of trainers is going to update. It's going to remove visually that trainer that we deleted. Because when it reruns getTrainers, it grabs from the database again. But this time, that trainer isn't inside of our database, right? Like it's gone because we deleted it with the Axios call in our delete function. And so now it grabs a new updated set of JSON from our backend. So that's kind of like how a lot of that sort of connects. Yeah, and like it's really cool. Like that's honestly like what makes React so cool is its ability to use state and use useEffect to cause re-renders, run certain functions and certain things when it re-renders. And that way we can sort of have our UI kind of update on the fly with like updated information, which is something that you can't do with just, vanilla JavaScript or with like a vanilla, like as a standard variable. That's kind of what makes React why it's called React and just kind of what makes it so cool. So yeah, that's like all I've got for today. But before we end, does anyone have any questions before we close out?
I'm just curious, can you pass multiple functions and multiple arrays into the useEffect so that like multiple things would happen on mount?
Yes, you can. So for example, inside of one useEffect block, you can run like multiple functions. So I could basically, I could also run my increase num function here, you can run multiple things. If you want a useEffect block to be tied to multiple pieces of state though, what you have to do is you have to actually use another useEffect block and then pass it a different thing there. So you can have a whole lot of stuff inside of the useEffect block. You can only have it tied to one thing in here. But you will sometimes see people use, and there are times when you might want to have multiple useEffects in one component that are tied to different pieces of state. So.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Okay, cool. All right. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing. I'm gonna stop the recording.